I had lost all the notes that I made previously on this presentation, so I had to really listen quite hard and make notes as I go. There's a couple of areas that I'd like to focus on, and I don't know how much this will resonate with our guests here today. The first one is perhaps rather particular, and that's about high-level young learners. You've talked about ESP and so on, and I wonder, because I have taught high-level young learners, and I wonder whether other people have, and I wonder whether you would care to comment on any specifics that you can think of that might apply here, dealing with, I'm talking about, pre-teens, basically, at C1, yeah, that's kind of where I want to focus. C1, C2, pre-teens, yeah.
My teaching experience is with older young learners, so the 13 to 18 group. So I'm happy to comment on that. Christina, any experience with the pre?
God, I'm trying to forget this period. Yes, I did. Thank you very much. Schools, teaching at schools, so much fun. I mean, from what I remember and what really works with pre-teens and teens, is definitely something that is personalized, because, with high levels in general, young learners also, and please tell me, Steve, if that's your opinion also, you can't keep just blindly following the course books. It just doesn't work, because they're such a level that they get bored easily, and it just doesn't answer, and people are going to say, well, the kids, they don't really have you'd be surprised. They do have linguistic needs, even if it is to follow their favorite influences. So it is essential. And I think this should be like a call of to arms. The needs analysis before any level, and trying to, and like you mentioned, Neil, trying to step away from the tyranny of the course books. We think they're here to help us, but at the end of the day, they might be helping the teachers. It might not be helping high level learners, whether they be young or older.
Yeah.
That's interesting, because you bring in there the needs analysis, which I think presupposes a certain degree of reflective ability that emerges probably with teens and on. Now we're stereotyping terribly here, but you can ask a young kid, well, why do you want to learn English? And they might say, oh, so I can talk to my friends while I'm gaming, or I can game better. But what strikes me is that for the pre-teen, probably their language development could well have happened in spite of the teacher and not because of the teacher. And this massive exposure in a highly technically integrated, technically developed world, access to movies, music, streaming, I think has a major role to play, which kind of argues for that massive exposure model. Now, the critical period hypothesis has been brought into question. But I do have this sense that there is a distinction to be made between the post-puberty brain rather, and the pre-puberty brain. And I think, young learners, you don't teach them grammar, or at least you shouldn't, because it's conceptual. It's hard.
You mean you don't teach them declarative grammar?
Right. You give them access to language, you give them tasks, you help them to shape their responses and to try it again. But you're not going to stand up, I hope, with a group of 8 or 9-year-olds and say, no, present perfect here, everyone, not past simple.
You'd be surprised who does that.
I hope you're not going to do that with anybody, never mind.
Indeed.
I just want to run back, if I might. I'm sorry, I don't want to spend too much time on this because it probably isn't relevant to everybody, but the needs analysis for young learners will take a different form.
Yeah.
I think it won't be as what shall we say? It won't be as introverted, perhaps, as it might be for an adult learner. But then you can certainly ask young learners, what they like to do, and that's the starting point, I think. And then you find out they like to play football with their friends, or they like to watch particular things on TV, and so on. And so I think you have it's a kind of subterfuge in a sense. You have to build a young learner needs analysis around what they say, but also around what they don't say.
Yes. How would you go about doing that, Steve?
I sit down and have a chat.
Okay.
That's all. Simple as that.
Given their level, that chat is in English.
Yes, it has to be. Yes, it'll be in English, even whatever level they are. Because if they're below a level that they can have that conversation, then there's no need to have that conversation. We have to get them to a point where they can have that conversation, and then you have that conversation. Does that make sense?
That's interesting, Steve. Are you saying that before that level, for any learners, you would kind of assume what they need and design tasks according to those assumptions? And I'm not quite sure what you would otherwise advise, like going with a course book? How would you do it?
I've never advised anyone to use a course book.
That's what I was thinking. I was like,
no. What I wanted to, perhaps we can shift this in a slightly different direction and talk about approach. Neil, you talked about TBL, which is Prabhu, of course, not thingy and thingy. And I wondered, then I think, Christina, you put up a note about teachers not having the time to prepare tasks and all. Absolutely agree with you. But I'm thinking that approaches aren't pure, and you can mix TBL, task-based learning, with dogma, for example, and that they slot together surprisingly well. And
Can I just ask you, Steve, forgive me for interrupting, but in case some of our people here and perhaps not so clear about dogma and TBL,
okay, sorry,
just briefly gloss them for us.
Absolutely, a quick overview. Go into a classroom and use stuff which is around to do stuff. It's a little less academic than perhaps it might be expressed, but fundamentally you're using whatever there is around, and you're using authentic stuff. In an ideal world, you have a classroom which is rich in content, physical content, and you use that physical content to create situations to have people. I mean, there's a huge crossover here between TBL, Prabhu's task-based learning, dogma, which is, I think, from originally, apart from being a Danish film movement, I think, Scott Thornberry's original idea. But also, what's his name? Dear, I'm getting old.
Luke Meddings?
No, Asher, James Asher.
Okay.
Yeah. And he did, of course, what was his approach called? Yeah, I really am getting old. Where you use the golden tense, you get people to do stuff, and then you have learners.
Physical response.
Sorry?
Total physical response.
Thank you very much. That's exactly right. So what I'm suggesting is that there's a very clear, for me, there's a very clear line, when I can remember the words, between TBL, dogma, and
TPR.
Physical TPR. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. No course
I never thought about bringing TPR into dogma, but yeah, that'd be something interesting.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? All of these are all about holistic, person-centered ways of developing, encouraging, facilitating language use, not nuts and bolts grammar form.
Absolutely.
And I think what's interesting, and looking at some of the comments that have come up in task, is that it's almost as if language teachers are being brought into the profession using the very approaches that are perhaps the least, what's the word I want to use?
Effective.
Learning friendly. That there is this idea that you've got a course book and you sit down and you follow the course book, and it's that phrase, isn't it? Today we did the present perfect. I'm sure we've all experienced, and when I say we all, not just the three of us, but let's hear from our participants joining us today, that situation where you go in the next day and what have you done recently? And the present perfect just isn't there, because that kind of PPP, present, practice, produce, actually doesn't work. And it certainly doesn't seem to be, and when I say doesn't work, it might work within the parameters of a 1 hour, a 40-minute lesson, but it's not very sticky.
Let me I have to jump in. PPP doesn't work. I maintain that nothing works and nothing doesn't work.
Okay.
And I think that what you're talking about refers really to U-shaped learning, which probably people know about this, but quick overview of U-shaped learning is when you start here with something. Let's take the present perfect, for example. Today's lesson was on the present perfect. I'm not suggesting that's a good idea. I'm just suggesting it happens. Today's lesson on present perfect, and tomorrow you seem to have forgotten it. Now, what do we do then? How do we cope with that? And the idea is that if you follow this U all the way around my face, you get back up to a point which is close to where you began, because it fades. It needs to be processed by the brain, and it needs to be in a sense reignited. So the idea that something, don't be surprised if the present perfect doesn't appear tomorrow, but you can still refer to it, and that's the way to stimulate it, to get it coming back through this U to reach the top. Don't say things like, we did this yesterday, you should know it.
I query that, because in terms of that U shape and the kind of the what should be anticipated as the dip to come back up the other side, can I clarify that really that's not about reigniting technical words like present perfect, but it's about reigniting language use. So it's about talking about experience, not talking subject, has, have, plus, past.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That sort of declarative nonsense is completely out of the window for me.
But what really bugs me, thinking about what you were saying, is that thinking about our audience and thinking about where we are as teacher trainers, this is what we teach the people that come into the profession. We train them on PPP. We train them that, they've acquired this, then you move on, synthetic syllabi and all that. And every time we mention, well, according to research, SLA research, this is not high acquisition, this is not how we acquire language, this is not conducive to learning or to acquisition or whatever. Every time we say something like this, people say, but it's just, later on, delta level, not CELTA. But why? If instead of saying, okay, we do, this is what we have to do because they can't reach that. No, it's a question of a shift of paradigm, I think. It's just, why do we have to go according to the PPP or whatever the approach is? Why don't we just start from the beginning instead of teaching them one way at CELTA level or any preliminary teaching diploma? Why is it that we are taught as teachers a certain way, and it's only later on that we have to discover on our own or through Delta or through whatever? Oh, by the way, it doesn't really work. I find this.
Can I come in here, because I think this is quite a high level discussion, and that's fine, but there will be teachers perhaps with us today and also watching this video who are thinking, well, okay, this sounds all well and good, but what do I do in my classroom to actually affect a change? Now, there's a very interesting comment. I don't know your name, I'm sorry, Oppo A83. I doubt that's your real name. But Oppo A83 in the last comment talks about the fact, I don't think it's about the approach, whether it's task-based learning or PPP. It's about the aims you set and how you handle the process to achieve them in a way that matches with your students' needs, and bear in mind that the mere purpose in the end is to integrate whatever helps them to communicate. So with that approach of an eclectic kind of, well, whatever it takes, we've started off, and I think we ought to go back to the C2 learner. But of course, to get to the C2 learner, that C2 learner at one point was maybe a beginner or maybe a false beginner. What are simple steps that we can take that make the language classroom as purposeful, memorable, and SLA friendly as possible? What are the practical tips?
I mean, I think the first one is don't assume you know. That's the first thing we need to realize. Don't assume that as a teacher, you automatically know about what is not about the techniques. Fair enough. I completely agree. We have the professional knowledge. That's not what I meant. But don't assume that. Oh, hi, Zaina. You're from Lebanon. I live there. I live in Lebanon. So hello. So don't assume that as a teachers, we know the needs of the learners. We need to be aware, and we need to be open, and we need to ask them. I think that's the first thing we need to do. Identify the needs of the learners. What is it that they want to communicate? And then we target that. I think that's it. Communication. I would say communication is the first step. Something that we don't automatically do. Sorry, Steve, go for it.
No. I'd like to just move that sideways slightly, because one of the notes that I made up here is something that you did touch on, Leon, and that's the difference between needs and wants.
Yeah.
I'm always reminded when this comes up by a French gentleman I taught many years ago, with whom I did a needs analysis, one-to-one needs analysis, and we determined what he needed the language for, and so on and so on. We went about half an hour, we chatted, and I said to him, okay, what about pronunciation? Pronunciation was absolutely unintelligible. So I said to him, so what are we going to do about pronunciation? And he said, don't even think about it. Don't touch the way I speak. It is my soul. So I'm reminded that that what learners need and what they want are not necessarily the same thing at all. And this is really important. But I agree with you, Christina, that but this of course applies at any level, doesn't it? Except right down below beginner level.
When the suggestion for today's topic was first raised in discussion with gallery teachers, the request was to somehow merge the needs analysis, as it is often called, with teaching C2 levels, which perhaps explains why it was an extremely long input session, for which I kind of felt the need to apologise.
Good.
But hopefully they kind of do. They do have coherence in why and how they fit together. But yes, absolutely. Whether you're teaching a highly proficient in their first language and desiring to be highly proficient in their second language, sophisticated learner to become a neurosurgeon working through the medium of English, or a group of Chinese 9-year-olds who are learning English and have an incredibly high level at that age. If we're not engaging the learners in something that they find enjoyable, useful, and purposeful, we've missed a trick, I think. So, so starting point number one, establish what it is you're going to do and why you're doing it. Don't make any assumptions. Get the student involved. Start with their agency. Step one. Step two, do you think my assertion today that there is a kind of a decline here? There's, on the one hand, there is that kind of synthetic approach, grammar McNuggets, to use Thornbury stage, and on the other hand, a more holistic, dogme TBLT TPR approach, and that actually we can shift back and forth. How does that seem as the second stage of implementing a student SLA friendly classroom?
I'm not sure what you mean by SLA friendly, because SLA is not giving us very much at the moment, and hasn't for a while. So I'm not really sure.
What I think I'm saying by SLA friendly is that there does seem to be, if you follow people like Long, a good evidence base for developing procedural knowledge of a language as being more effective than going for the being able to talk about the grammar.
Okay.
So as a very simplified and maybe simplistic way of talking about integrating SLA, that's what I mean.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Does that help clarify?
Yes, thank you. I thought you were going to refer to something which was new and upcoming, but of course we're talking really about a communicative approach, as opposed to the communicative approach, right? Which focuses on procedural knowledge rather than declarative knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay, and that too, I think, applies to all levels. Can I once again just shift this ever so slightly? I hope it's just a nudge in a slightly different direction. And that is, I noticed that teachers very, very often, almost always, discuss amongst themselves things like pronunciation and what they should be doing with it. And I don't think it's our decision. I think it's a decision which has to be made together with students in general. But it's extremely rare, particularly if you go onto fora, social media stuff, teachers groups and so on. It's extremely rare that you find teachers saying things like, well, I like to ask my students how much pronunciation they want. I like to ask my students how much correction they want, error correct, and so on and so on and so on. And so we make these decisions. And I think this is a temptation at very high level. I think it's possibly a higher temptation when you're talking about C1, C2 students, because you know that precision here is going to be quite important. If people are going for the Cambridge and so on, then you know that precision is going to be quite important. And I wonder if that's right, and whether we shouldn't still be saying to ourselves, well, this is a decision that we have to make together. This is a negotiation we have to have.
I remember vividly, we've talked about it off camera a bit, the very first time we met, where Jennifer Jenkins, who was published extensively in stage 1 of English as a lingua franca, where it's really looking at ELF as a pronunciation only phenomenon. It's moved on from that significantly.
Yeah.
And she was having a fairly, animated discussion with the head of a teacher training body. And the discussion started by the guidelines that were given to Cambridge examiners about mutual intelligibility. And the point that was made is that you've got 2 or 3 students sitting in a room doing a task. It might be choosing from a list of 8 activities, the 5 that would be best for a student party. And the point that was made that the examiner, who is not part of the discussion, rates the student's pronunciation. But in fact, at no point was there any reference to the extent that the students could understand one another. So the mutual intelligibility was the person not involved in the conversation, rather than the mutual intelligibility in the people who were talking to one another.
Absolutely. I mean, this is really, really interesting. I recall, I hope it's relevant, I did a story with the Cuisenaire rods, and I had a group of students, and I was recording it for some research that I had microphones hanging down all over the room, with their permission, of course. And at a certain point, one of them had to explain to their partner, because they were recreating this story. And one of a Japanese girl and a Korean girl sitting together, I still have the recording somewhere, And the Japanese girl said, "But why cry? Why is she crying? Why is she crying? This woman, why is she crying?" And the Korean girl said, "No, no, 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 not cry, 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 cry," like that, right? So they were working on mutual intelligibility. I had nothing to do with it. I thought it was a fabulous moment, and what students can do if you leave them alone.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, that went off slightly on a different track, but anyway.
But it's such a good. I was going to say it's such an important point, isn't it? Now, I think Magella, unfortunately, has had to leave us, but Magella and I have a very similar teaching context. We are preparing doctors and nurses, mainly doctors, to work internationally in the field of medicine. Perhaps working in America, Australia, New Zealand, the UK. And I'm always asking myself, what is the benchmark for a doctor's pronunciation? And what I think is really nice is that in the criteria, it's not pronunciation, it's intelligibility. And for me, that's key, because there was a really interesting conversation going on about pronunciation standards, which Hussein was part of. And for me, I do have the luxury, and I think it shouldn't be a luxury, but it is, of being able to ask my learners, what do you want me to do with your pronunciation? Do you want me to correct you? When do you want to be corrected? How do you want to be corrected? Do you want to sound like me? Hopefully not. Or is your own accent fine for you? The challenge perhaps comes where you've got a group of learners, 150 in the class. How do you negotiate that? Where you can raise their awareness that they have options, but then there's the issue of preparing them for a test, where the test, I remember Austrian and German learners who sounded to me absolutely natural, getting very low marks because their teachers deemed that they weren't meeting the criteria of absolute native-like pronunciation. Christina, given your very interesting profile as a native speaker, but someone who came into English through education rather than an accident of birth, how do you navigate this?
It's quite. I mean, when it comes to accent and all that, this is something that's all the time, because I still have a little bit of French. I mean, I'm sorry, you can still hear it. And I have a little bit of British, and people just go, what is it? And people, like, even on CELT courses, they're like, which one should I use? Is it like, should I follow you because, you're Brit? And I'm like, don't. You're looking for, and this is the word you were saying, Neil, intelligibility. That's all we need. People were saying that we have some trainees from Morocco. They say, oh, it has to be RP, the pronunciation. And you're like, just let that go. Let that go. How do you say it? Do you put the stress in the right place? It doesn't matter. The whole native, non-native thing is just horrendous. How many times, I mean, Stephen, Neil, you don't have that problem, but how many times have I not been able to have certain jobs just because, must have British passport or must have Australian passport accepted, but British and American preferred. And you're like, what is this? How is that even fair? The whole native speakerism is just ridiculous on just so many levels. And you must have seen this also. I mean, you on the point of, you employ people, but do you find also, guys, that sometimes, people go, oh, I'm not going to apply to you because I know you won't take me, and you just look at them sideways going, what is this?
There is a real push within the accredited UK sector, English UK, to move away as much as we can in all sorts of respects from that native speaker norm, because call a spade, it's wrong. I think what is also interesting is that if we look at some of the more modern course books, Voices, for example, published by National Geographic Cengage, that more and more the audio recordings are using a range of international speakers of English. And yet it's those same international teachers of English who are criticizing it because it's giving the wrong model. So there is a kind of a tension there. I mean,
it's about prestige. As a business owner abroad, people want native speakers. They, even if you are affiliated to one of the big ones, IH or whatever, still in the back of, and I know I've worked abroad for a very long time in the industry, and it's always like, oh, okay, we'll take you on. I'm like, well, at the time when I started, I didn't have any diplomas, any teaching diplomas, but I had the right accent. And I was like, well, how is that fair? And still now, 20 years since I began teaching, there's still, you can still see ads where our teachers are native speakers. And you're like, can we just say our teachers are CELT qualified, which, might not be.
If I can bring this around a bit back to the C2 context, but within this optic of accent, I remember I was very lucky to meet Maria Davu of Glosso Books a couple of months ago. And she had a really interesting take on this, which was, if I hear the term native speaker once again, I'm going to scream, because what is a native speaker from England? So, and she deliberately didn't say Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, because she was wanting to make the point how ridiculous this. Because I don't know if you know that I lived in Hull for many, many years, and if I speak like someone who comes from Hull, you're going to think that I sound quite different. But that's a native speaker accent, innit?
And I come from Birmingham originally.
Ah, Birmingham, Bab.
Yeah, Birmingham, yeah, Birmingham. So yes, what's a native speaker?
What is a native?
It drives me up the wall. Yeah. I mean, Louisiana is native speaker, but there are places we all agree.
And I think this is the challenge, isn't it, at the C2 level, that there is an assumption, I think, that as a learner approaches that point where their interlanguage, that mix of their L1 or L1s in English, gets closer and closer to the kind of construct of the L1 norm, that there is an assumption that so will pronunciation, or so will grammar. Well, I'm sorry, but how many times have I seen native speakers on Amazon writing should have with OF?
Oh, God. Oh, absolutely. Never mind Amazon. I've seen it in master's assignments.
Also true.
Oh, dear, dear.
So there is this monolithic approach of, if nothing else, I'm hoping today allows people to realize that the construct of a C2 level as being native-like is the wrong way to see it.
But you have to convince the exam boards of that as well. And here we get into a commercial vicious circle.
Yeah.
Because the exam boards, they're all as bad as each other as far as I'm concerned.
They feed the course books.
Pardon?
They feed the course book, and the course book feed the exam preparation. And the exam preparation is just...
Absolutely. And then if you add into the mix the commercial aspects of running a school, of running a language school, a private language school, of course they're advertising our teachers of native speakers. Of course they do. And this prolongs the event. It just makes the whole thing worse.
But that's the thing. Parents expect the best, and for them, that is what they want.
We have to, it's a ridiculous thing to say, but we have to educate. And that means educating parents, and that means educating students. It means educating exam boards, for God's sake. It's a monumental task. It's not going to happen tomorrow.
And
which is not a reason to give up, of course.
exactly, and that's why I was so delighted when, in conversation with Maria, who is based in Athens, Greece, that she was actually able to demonstrate that by moving away from a exam course book scenario for an exam course preparation program, that she got better results from using upside down than she had done with course books. And the Greek market is absolutely course book exam preparation driven. The students are taking C2 at 16 and 17. It's bonkers.
Wow.
I think that perhaps gives us hope with which to start to bring things to a close today. That yes, there is pressure on us from bosses, from language schools, from exam boards, from parents, from the students themselves, but that doesn't mean to say that a response where we develop our students' communicative procedural use of the language is in what's the word I'm looking for, is not consistent with their ability to pass exams. Actually, Maria's small research study of 150 learners seems to suggest that there is hope, and that if we be a bit radical, we can still fulfill our parents and our exam boards requirements and give our students an opportunity at loving using English rather than being sausages in a sausage factory.
Definitely.
Which
That's a good thought to finish on.
Thank you both. I hope for the sake of our audience, who have been incredibly loyal, sticking with us as the conversation has moved around the topic. So thank you everyone for joining us today.